Okay, to folks that are watching from the live stream, we will be starting in about 10 minutes. I'm going to mute the mics for now, but this is just so you can check to see that you're getting audio. And I guess give Matt a call if you're having any problems.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for the second annual Disproportionate Minority Contact webinar. My name is Jacqueline Bunn, and I'm the Executive Director of the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, also known as CJCC. CJCC is the designated state agency for administering agency for the U.S. Department of Justice grant programs. CJCC is comprised of members from all of the components of the criminal justice system and is responsible for administering grants for criminal justice system management, improvement, and victims' assistance and compensation. Within the grants division of CJCC, the Juvenile Justice Unit houses the Disproportionate Minority Contact Subcommittee called DMC. The DMC subcommittee works to understand the root causes of disproportionate contact, as well as ensuring that all children, regardless of race, ethnicity, or class, have equal and fair treatment under the law. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Today, you will hear information from experts in the field on 1, the use of evidence-based practices and programs and how they reduce DMC. 2, the philosophy behind the new detention assessment instrument tool and its immediate impact on reducing DMC. And 3, the impact of school-based referrals on DMC. Following this presentation, if you have any questions, please contact the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council's Juvenile Justice Unit. Now, it is both an honor and a privilege to introduce our first speaker, the Honorable Stephen Teskey, Chief Judge, Clayton County Juvenile Court.
Thank you, Director Bunn. It is a privilege to be here, and I want to thank the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council for hosting this very important event on disproportionate minority contact. I will be presenting on, as she has stated, an overview of evidence-based practice and programs and how they reduce DMC. And I'm going to break this down in chapters, one building upon the other, laying a foundation first and then putting up the walls and then the roof, I hope. And first chapter is understanding evidence-based practice and programs. And to do that, I think we need to go way back to the mid-1970s to a very now famous article written by a scholar at the time, a researcher named Martinson. And his article became dubbed as the Nothing Works article. And what we have during this period of time since the mid-70s when it was published to today is a journey from nothing works to what works. And what happened is that in the 1970s when Martinson published this article, he was stating that nothing out there was working to reduce recidivism. That created an uproar among the various disciplines, from sociology to criminology, to those in the probation field, and other researchers. And the importance of Martinson's article was that in creating the uproar, those in the field that were researching realized they had not been researching what was working and what doesn't work. And that's why in the mid-1970s, nothing was working, because we didn't know what was working. And so that is what created what we now have is the plethora of research and studies on evidence-based practice and programs. Now, with that foundation, one of the key principles in the foundation of what works and what doesn't work is, number 1, targeting high-risk offenders using risk assessment tools. Now, I'm going to define what I mean by high-risk offenders and how do we identify high-risk offenders versus low or medium risk offenders. Let's begin, first of all, since we are talking about kids, is understanding the adolescent brain research. that we now know from research beginning in 1999 that this part of the brain, the prefrontal lobe cortex, is what translates emotion into logic. In other words, we can say, and to sum it up, and I don't mean to oversimplify it, but kids are neurologically wired to do stupid things. And with that said, that means they're under neurological construction. We now know that this part of the brain is not fully developed until age 25. And so think about it for a moment. If that part of the brain, which translates emotion to logic, is not developed till age 25, that means the kids are still under neurological construction. So it begs the question, if they're under neurological construction, where do we want them to be? Do we want them to be in detention facilities when they don't need to be in detention facilities with other kids who are high risk, who are definitely delinquent, committing burglaries, stealing cars on an ongoing basis, very seriously involved in gangs and drive-by shootings and things of that nature? No, we don't. And so with that said, laying this foundation about targeting high-risk offenders and distinguishing from low-risk offenders is to make sure that we don't mix the populations. So we don't unintentionally take those kids who make us mad and turn them into kids who will scare us. Why? Because we want to reduce recidivism, we want to avoid hyper-recidivism, and of course, we want to reduce DMC. So I'm going to break this down for you, beginning with hyper-recidivism, which is when an individual or system responds to an offender using a technique that exacerbates the risk to reoffend. For example, a moment ago when I said those kids, mixing those kids who make us mad, the lower risk kids, with the kids who scare us, what we are doing is that we are increasing the risk that those kids who make us mad will turn into those kids who are truly delinquent. We want to avoid a system that actually is counterproductive. In a juvenile justice system, we want to prevent recidivism. We want to prevent the reoffending. But if we're not smart about the way we do our business, given the research, the evidence-based practices and programs that we now possess, then we become a system that is indeed abusive, counterproductive. And when we are like that, then we are actually compromising community safety. We, the system, are contributing to crime in our community. Let me give you an example. What you see here is a 3-year recidivist study of kids who were diverted in the Clayton County juvenile justice system. Now, what I mean by that is that in 2010, of all the complaints that were filed in my court, we then had an independent study in which somebody from the outside came in, tracked those kids that were diverted in 2010. Now, we're looking at about 729 diversions out of a total of 1,259 complaints that were filed that year, delinquent complaints. So as you could see, we actually diverted more than half of the complaints that came in. Yet look, practically 70% of the kids that we diverted, we never saw again over 3 years. And it begs the question, okay? We need to be careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, that we need to have an assessment system up front, what I call the front-end loading approach, to ensure that we identify which kids who make us mad versus the kids who scare us, all right? And the kids who make us mad, that we ensure that they do not go deeper into the system and we make them worse and actually over-criminalize them, and then we compromise community safety. So when we take a look at the shock factor, kids in handcuffs, and we must ask ourselves, what's wrong with this picture, right? When we lock up more kids than we need to. In the United States, we incarcerate more people, including kids, than any other nation in the world, all right? And when we put handcuffs on a kid, we need to be asking ourselves, what does this do to the kid? Does this traumatize the kid? And when it traumatizes the kid, what is that doing to the kid in terms of his behavior later in life? Ladies and gentlemen, traumatized people traumatize people. And so it presents the question, to what extent should judges and others in juvenile justice play a role in guarding against trauma for the protection of kids and for public safety? So, in trying to determine who makes us mad and who scares us, we now know from the research that we can do a pretty decent job of predicting future behavior. For example, this one graph, among many studies that have been conducted since the late 1970s, since the Martinson Nothing Works article, that you could see that those kids who scored 0, which is the lowest risk, had the lowest recidivist rate, versus those who scored a 6, which is the highest risk level, had the highest recidivist rate. So we can predict that future behavior. The question is, to what extent are we truly using these risk assessment instruments? All right. And in fact, coming up next will be the Deputy Commissioner of DJJ, Carl Brown, who's going to hone in and give more detail behind the philosophy of the use of the detention assessment instrument and how it can reduce DMC. So before we go deeper into the detail, okay, let's create an analytical framework. How should we be analyzing our system, looking at our systems, whether you're at the county level, all right, and you're asking yourself, how can I go about reducing disproportionate minority contact, reducing racial and ethnic disparity? And so we need to look at it from a systems model, all right? So look at it this way. Ask yourself this. When you sit around the table, take a look at your system broken down this way. This is what we call the detention decision points analytical framework. Beginning with the streets. How are decisions made out on the streets with police interacting with kids and families? There's the schools. And Diana Aspinwall is going to be talking after the Deputy Commissioner regarding school referrals, because she's going to tell you that schools can be a very big referent of delinquent acts. And many of them are misdemeanors, are low-risk kids. How can we wrap our heads around the schools in reducing DMC? Then there's the intake. So now we're getting to the court, the front door of the court. How can we do a better job in assessing the kids who are brought to our door at intake and making decisions on, wait, this is a kid who makes us mad, but he doesn't scare us. We need to treat this kid differently. We don't need this kid to go any deeper into the system. And then the next step would be, well, there's the detention hearing. In Georgia, it's going to be within 48 hours of the child having been detained. So at that detention hearing, what other opportunities and mechanisms and tools that can be used to say, hey, okay, we can release this kid. He does not need to go back to detention. We have a safe alternative. And then there's the disposition hearing. At that point, when, okay, if the child is found to be delinquent at the disposition hearing, is in need of treatment and supervision, how are we going to handle this child in a way that we are going to meet the needs of that child, and that every child who is similarly situated, okay, is going to be treated the same? Simple, equal protection, which is very important to ensure that we are reducing racial and ethnic disparity. And then even beyond that, what about probation? So we have a child who's been found delinquent, and the child then is placed on probation, let's say, okay? How are we managing that child on probation in a way that we ensure that that child is not going to be at risk, a higher risk of being detained and treated differently because of their, because of their race or ethnicity? And then lastly, the deep end youth. Those are the kids that a judge is thinking about placing or committing with the State Department of Juvenile Justice for residential care or or into a secure environment, a YDC. So that's how we're going to break the rest of this down. And I strongly urge and recommend that at home, at work, that the administration, the juvenile judges, court administrators, your relevant stakeholders, the director of your local DJJ, and others who are involved in working with kids from law enforcement, gather together and take a look at each one of these boxes along the spectrum of the detention decision points analytical framework. Now, with that, let's consider this. Stacked interactive risk domains. I think it's very important for later that we understand what are the influences on a child that will promote or increase the risk of delinquency. And essentially, we have about 5 of them here, okay? Number one, the neighborhood. You see the larger oval shape. Within that is the family. And then you have the child. And then you have the others, the peers and the school. So essentially, what happens is that, and this is a very important illustration because later on when we talk about, how do we effectively help kids and their families to reduce recidivism, we're going to be looking at these particular domains. Are there any characteristics within these domains about that child in which that child's being influenced in those domains that increases the risk of recidivism for which we need to be addressing? And we can do that using an assessment tool, which I will talk about in just a moment. So we have various risk protective factors within the child domain as we do within the family domain and also within the school. And let me just kind of break these down for you. Within the child domain, and I'm not going to list everything in all the domains, but I just want to give you a flavor of what they look like. But when we're focusing just on the child domain, we should be asking ourselves, and this is what assessment tools do, okay? They try to identify the risk factors and the protective factors, okay? Do we have a child who's exhibiting characteristics of delinquency that is in violence, aggressive behavior, impulsivity, substance abuse, externalizing problems like projecting, it's not my fault, it's the blaming behavior, low self-aspirations, drug exposure, a positive attitude toward delinquency, antisocial in that sense, and therefore anti-establishment attitudes, high alcohol use, psychiatric disorders, violence victimization, gang membership, gun carrying, and drug selling. Now, if we were to take this, we also have a list of risk factors that are associated with the family domain, also with the school domain. And let me sum it up this way, that we identify these in using the term criminogenic needs. Those are delinquency-producing needs. Generally, there are 8 of those, but to sum it up, we're looking at cognitive, that is attitude, values and beliefs. How does the kid think, okay? Is the kid thinking antisocial, prosocial? So you can take all these things and put them into 8 categories. School connectedness. It's not just, is the kid going to school, but does the child feel connected to the school? And how is the school relating to the kid, okay? And we have weak or poor problem-solving skills, substance abuse as mentioned here, family function. But here's the thing that we've learned from the research, that the #1 cause of delinquency, the greatest cause is family function, for family dysfunction. The second one is school connectedness, followed by peers. Your peers, are they pro-social, antisocial? In this case, antisocial. Okay, Chapter 3, school and street detention decision points. So now we're moving into the detention decision points, box by box, identifying diversion for police and schools. So that's what you want to be thinking. As early as you can, when the child comes in contact with law enforcement, the system needs to be asking itself this: is this the type of child who scares me versus the child who makes me mad? What systems can we employ, or tools that we can employ out on the streets, in the schools, that we will not send or refer this kid to the juvenile court because it can be handled by other alternative means or options? Now, I'm going to pick on the schools for just a moment in a good way and just use that domain as an example. I already mentioned school connectedness, and you see here some research. There's a lot more research that is out there that illustrates the importance of school connectedness as a protective buffer. Or, you know, if we're not doing good in promoting school connectedness in the community, then it becomes the second greatest cause of delinquency in a child in your community. I think it's very important. The last point here on the slide is that out-of-school suspension of elementary and middle school students contributes to dropout rates. And that's extremely important because as Ms. Aspinwall is going to be discussing later, that, you know, we have also, through zero tolerance policies in this country, have then moved from not only out-of-school suspensions, pushing kids out of school that leads to expulsion, but arresting kids as well and putting them in the juvenile justice system. This has been one of the greatest contributors to disproportionate minority contact. In fact, there are studies that show that African-American kids are 6 times as likely, and Latino kids are 3 times as likely to be suspended out of school or arrested than their white counterparts for the same offense on the first offense. And that's pretty dramatic. I think that's a very significant statement. And I want to sum it up this way, okay? I mean, who would ever think that keeping kids in school would increase graduation rates? All right? I mean, that's the way we need to be thinking, is how do we keep kids in school, out of courts, so they will be moving on a pathway toward a positive, healthy future. And especially for kids of color, where we know that we have a system that does very seriously introduce them to the juvenile justice system at a disproportionate rate. And here's another thing we need to be thinking about. Why diversion at intake can sometimes be too late when we talk about the school domain. The Gary Sweeten study shows us that a student who's arrested in high school is twice as likely to drop out. And a student who appears in court during high school is 4 times as likely to drop out. So to my judicial colleagues out there who I know are doing a tremendous, wonderful job at intake and working to divert these school referrals that are coming into your court, this study makes this statement to me as a judge that no matter how well I do to divert these school referrals at intake, I'm still having to worry about those kids that we even brought to my door in the first place, that were handcuffed, arrested on campus, because we have already increased the risk of them twice as likely dropping out of school. And so in that sense, that's why I think that, you know, it's important that we as judges think about our convening authority or ability, especially using the community-based risk reduction program statute in the juvenile code that authorizes juvenile court judges to engage stakeholders from the school system to the police, to the Board of Health, to the district attorney, and bringing them together to develop written protocols to not only address delinquency and dependency and CHINS cases, but also there's language there to prevent these things from happening in the first place. So how can we as judges reach out to our peers in the community, our stakeholder leaders, and say, can we come together and talk about how can we work on those reducing the number of kids who are arrested on campus, okay? And I'll talk about that in just a moment as well. In fact, I'll go into that right now. The school offense protocol agreement that we did in Clayton County back in 2003, we were the first county in the United States to develop such a protocol. In that protocol, we identified various acts that cannot be referred to the juvenile court. Today it's grown, we've now amended our agreement, and it includes all misdemeanors. All misdemeanors can no longer be referred to the juvenile court. The only exceptions would have to be exigent circumstances. And felonies, the police have discretion. They are not required to arrest kids on felonies. In Georgia, for those of us in Georgia, we know terroristic threats. Kids, prefrontal lobe cortex, you know, sometimes say stupid things. They don't necessarily mean it. They know they can't act on it. I'm going to kill you. They're really angry. It's a terroristic threat. But does it necessitate, and it's a felony, but does it necessitate a kid being handcuffed and hauled off to the juvenile court? And I say in many circumstances, the answer is no. And so we give our police officers on campus discretion not to arrest a kid on a felony. Special education. In the Clayton County school system, you cannot arrest a kid with an IEP without the administrator and the intake supervisor's permission. Okay? Can't do it. We want to make sure that those kids with, you know, who are EBD or LD, emotional behavioral disorder or learning disabilities, and a lot of folks, we need to understand that many kids who are EBD because they have experienced trauma in their life, and in that trauma they are triggered, and you get too close to them, their trigger goes off, the trigger is pulled, and they'll push back. And what is an assault on a teacher is really triggered from something very traumatic in that child's life, and we can use other means to handle that kid, especially if that act happens to be a manifestation of that disability. Probationers that are on school campus, you cannot arrest them on a focus act, on a misdemeanor, okay, or in the police discretion of felony without first consulting the probation officer. Of course, we have school-based probation. I think Ms. Aspon will be talking about school-based probation and their wonderful program with the Department of Juvenile Justice and how effective that is, because school-based probation, as she will tell you, will be used in a very positive way. That is to promote graduation rates and to be able to intervene and negotiate and mediate matters on school campus. And so with those parameters in mind, kids who do commit those acts on the first offense, generally it's a warning with some exceptions. So for example, possession of marijuana, while a warning may not be good enough, they can be referred to a drug education program, which we at the court provide that in our restorative justice division. The second offense is a referral to a program, and the third offense, a complaint can be filed. This gives you an idea of what's happened as a result of the MOU, the agreement. The red line you see here, the misdemeanors, let me sum it up this way. You know, when the SRO program began, we only had maybe 49 referrals the year before. That's all. By the year, 2003, 2004, we had over a 2,000% increase in referrals. Almost 1,400 referrals, of which 92% of them were misdemeanors. Okay, it was obviously out of control. You could see here along the line that we instituted certain things, beginning with the MOU, the school justice agreement was signed. I just want to make a point there. You'll notice that it took us 9 months to agree on how we're going to do it. But during that 9 months, we already began to see a decline in the referrals. And here's the reason why. And this goes to the credit of the professionals around the table. Because our chief of police and our school superintendent would leave the meetings And obviously having, been involved in the conversation on their own, realizing this is not the right thing that we're doing, they started enacting policies on their own to decrease that before we even signed the agreement. Then I'll be talking in a moment about the Quad CST, which was our answer to those kids that were no longer being arrested. What are we going to do with them? How are we going to handle them? What's the response going to be like, okay? What about those kids who are not even responding to the traditional responses, okay? Why are they not responding? Could it be that they're not responding because they've had a traumatic event in their life? Could it be a mental health or mental illness, some type of disorder in that way? And so it's, what may work with Johnny, who doesn't have any of that, what I'll just say, issues and baggage that kind of makes them that hot mess, so to speak, okay? It's working with Johnny, but it's not working with this other kid. We need to be asking the question why. So instead of just throwing those kids away, we want to dig deeper. And so we developed the Quad CST, which is the Clayton County Collaborative Child Study Team, and they meet every week, sometimes multiple times during the week. And now they meet at the schools where the kids are located to make it convenient for the kids and the parents. It's a multidisciplinary team. And then, of course, our system of care was instituted, which is now our collective impact model approach in Clayton County. And it's a 17-member board of directors that's private and public. And what they do is that now all the collaborative initiatives, including this one, are collapsed under this umbrella called the system of care. And they have a full-time administrator, executive director, a monitor who monitors all the cases staffed at the Quad CST to make sure that the treatment is provided and the kids and families are being taken care of. This is interesting. Since we're talking about evidence-based juvenile justice program systems and practices, Mark Lipsey, a very well-known researcher in What Works, in a recent book published by Mark Lipsey and a couple of his colleagues, James Howland, John Wilson, a handbook for evidence-based juvenile justice and systems, stated on the discussion of diversion around school referrals, Judge Teskey's Georgia Clayton County School Referral Reduction Program is an ideal solution to excessive school suspension and expulsion. And to that, I will tell you, my team, the Clayton County Technical Assistance Team that's supported by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, we deliver technical assistance, have been doing so going on 5 years, now over 150 jurisdictions. We were in Albany, New York just last week, where we assisted 12 counties to develop a written agreement to reduce school referrals. The month before that, Richmond, Virginia. A month before that, Pinellas County, Florida. Wilmington, North Carolina. Before that, Charlotte, Mecklenburg. I can go on with the list. The point is that it would be nice. This is like a snowball. It's getting bigger and bigger. And I would like to see that happening in Georgia as well, as a way in which this is what I call low-hanging fruit. If you want to reduce DMC, okay, it's low-hanging fruit. It didn't cost us really any money to do this. Okay, chapter 4, intake decision point. Now we're at the front door of the juvenile court, okay? What do we do there? How can we implement detention decision-making in an effective way to reduce racial and ethnic disparity? This one study, 2011, this is important. Minority youth overrepresentation is highest in the arrest, detention, and waiver decisions. Think about that. That's how important that front door is and how we make our decisions at the front door of the juvenile court. Now, let's take Georgia. I serve on the Commission on Criminal Justice Reform here in Georgia. I co-chair the Oversight and Implementation Committee. And when it was, as a council, making the recommendations that led to House Bill 242, we took a look at our own data with the help of the Pew Charitable Trust. They did data dumping, analyzed it. And what you see here, and we have to keep this in mind, that what we do at the front door can create a pathway. Because we know from the research that when kids touch the juvenile justice system, that we've already increased the risk that they will become delinquent. If they're not already delinquent, if they just made that stupid decision that kids can sometimes do, but we make the mistake as an adult, we get mad at them and we handcuff them, we take them down the juvenile court, we put them in the RYDC. What are we doing? We are now creating a pathway to go deeper into the system that will make them worse and make our communities worse. And who's to blame for that? The system. Look, ladies and gentlemen, let me say this, that I say this all across the country. I haven't met a person yet in my travels across the country and in the state of Georgia that is in this business and they don't like kids, or they don't have a real passion for this, or they don't want to do the right thing. So it begs the question, why do we look here and we see such a horrible statistic in terms of overrepresentation of kids of color? All right. So we look at out-of-home placement. All right. 69% of the kids in out-of-home placement, all right, at that time, when we did this study in 2012, were African-American youth, which is that's practically double the population of African-American youth in this state. Why? Because let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen, people do not commit crimes because of the color of their skin. They commit crimes because for a number of other reasons. The circumstances they live in, the things that they're dealing with. And I'm going to make this one comment, that until we figure out that we look at our entire system in terms of the disproportionate number, we realize that there's a disproportionate number of families, families of color who are still in poverty, okay? And I'm going to say this because I think folks tend to stay away from it, and I don't think we're going to figure it out until we really address it, and it's this. And there are reasons that there's kids of color and families of color that are in poverty. A lot of it, in my opinion, has to do with histrionics, 300+ years of slavery and segregation. We dig a hole, we put them in that hole, we tell them they can't read, they can't write, and then all of a sudden in the 1960s, 54, we're celebrating the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. The 1960s civil rights voting. These legal freedoms do not and will not in and of themselves create economic mobility for people of color that we've put in the hole because of that institutional slavery and segregation. It takes a different approach, and we need to tackle that. And we know that poverty drives crime. We know there's trauma associated with poverty. Until you sit down and you really have a conversation with the kids who come from poor neighborhoods, I mean a really honest conversation, and let them tell you about what they see every day. The domestic violence, the shootings. And these kids are having to go into a classroom, and we expect them to learn when they're bringing that into the classroom. And we call that the responsivity principle. How well is this kid able to respond to what we're teaching the kid? Until we deal with those type of issues and help them deal with it and get a handle on it, they're not going to respond very well. So I just want to bring that up, just touch on that. I think our communities need to have a frank conversation. But it does create a pathway to the deep end, what happens at the detention, and can lead to further DMC at the deep end. And we need to keep that in mind and make that connection. But you know what, folks? Where I want to go is that no matter how passionate you are to help kids and families, no matter how great your heart is, if you're working in a broken system, good people make broken decisions still. So what the Deputy Commissioner, Carl Brown's going to be talking about, so I'm not going to go in detail, but I just want to touch on that point, what I call the detention decision tree, for which is the framework for developing DA, detention assessment instruments, and he's going to talk about the philosophy behind that. We're talking about validated instruments. You know, there is a science to this, okay? But what you see here is just simply a detention decision tree that, based upon the population in the state of Georgia, we can get a good handle on predicting that future behavior on kids. What is the risk level of this kid to reoffend? And by using an objective admissions instrument, we're able then to dismiss, you know, any personal biases that we may have and hold, okay? You know, whether it is based on race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status, or, hey, this kid made me mad, but does the kid really scare me? All right? Because I'm going to tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. I've been on the bench for 16 years, and I have to understand my own weaknesses, and I'm not perfect. And I will tell you, there's some things that kids say in my courtroom. There are things that they do in my courtroom, and they make me mad. But I got to make sure that I don't let them rent space in my head, that I respond in like manner and act like they are at 15 years of age. I must be the bigger, better person. I am a judge. And so when we talk about those kids that don't need to go into the system and be detained pending a 48-hour hearing, what should it look like? What are some things that we can develop in the community to ensure that while they're waiting to come back to court? And we call those alternatives to detention. And so I've stacked some here for you from very simple community detention, order, you know, bail. And, you know, I want to point a thing out about bail. This is interesting, so just keep this in mind. We are a bailable state. And I find it very interesting that when I look at the bail bond recognizant section in Title 17 for adults, because it says in the juvenile code that they're entitled to bail the same as adults. Notice that all misdemeanors are bailable. Every misdemeanor is bailable, except, of course, when you're dealing with domestic violence, those type of issues, okay? Now, it begs the question, if they're all bailable, why is it sometimes we are detaining so many kids on misdemeanors without bail? And, you know, so I'm just curious if one day somebody in the defense bar is finally going to figure that out, and we need to be ready for that. I think we need to be proactive and look at our own system about, but why is it that I don't use bail? You know, in my county, I do in a different way. It's because we have an alternative detention program, because we don't lock up misdemeanors. Number one, we don't lock them up, okay? And if we do need to have a safe alternative, we have safe alternatives for them. I think the other thing we need to keep in mind as well is that there are times I use bail, and it may be very simple as this. I mean, why make parents post bond for a kid, okay, when I can turn around and just say to mom and dad, what's his favorite toy? What's his favorite thing? Usually it's a PlayStation, Nintendo. You know what I do? I just take it. I take it and I hold on to it and I say, it's mine for right now. You comply with the conditions, you can get it back. All right? You'll be surprised what impact that has on kids. When you get to their level, their perspective, what do they like? And go there, okay? All right. Now, I need to be summing this up here, but I think this is the point I want to share with you. At this point, when we start talking about letting kids go or not detaining them, there's always some, not a lot, but there are some in the community that, or who are out there who say, oh, my gracious, Judge Teskey, you have to be the most liberal judge, the softest judge there is out there, okay? But ladies and gentlemen, don't let appearances fool you. Yes, it's true. Since we started using evidence-based practices, the detention assessment instrument, alternatives to detention, we've experienced an 80% decrease in average daily detention population in Clayton County, okay? 75% reduction in the average daily population of minority youth, a 47% reduction in the average length of stay. The felony rearrest rate, actually this is the year before, was 0. This past year it's less than 1%. A 72% fewer commitments to state custody. And I want to make a point that up until last year was 43% reduction, okay? It's increased to 73% a reduction because of our criminal justice reform and the creation of the incentive grant. We identified, we were wondering in Clayton County, how can we reduce any more commitments? We've already reduced it by 43% just on our own, okay? You've got to be careful not to think that way, okay? So the incentive grant forced us to take a look at the kids we were committing. We weren't really doing that. And when we did it, we did a random sampling of all these cases, and we found that 54% of the kids that we were committing, the highest risk factor was family dysfunction. So that's why we used an evidence-based program that's required under the incentive grant of family functional therapy. As a result, it increased the decrease to 73% commitments to the state, or 72%. 66% fewer commitments of minority youth. But get this, ladies and gentlemen, despite all those decreases, all that appearance of being soft on crime, our juvenile crime rate, that is the number of delinquency complaints filed in the county, is down 62%. 62%. Stated another way, that could be 62% less victims in the county too, at the hands of juveniles, all right? So, detention hearing decision point, I want to point out the FAST panel. Don't give up. Our FAST panel, Finding Alternatives for Safety and Treatment, that is a multidisciplinary panel, meets Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. It's been going on since 2003. And as you can see here in this photo, this is what they do every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Those kids who do score high, we do need to detain them. We still review them before the detention hearing to come up. Their job, their mission, can we get the kid out of jail today and keep the community safe? We don't give up on these kids, okay? All right. Chapter 6, disposition detention decision point. Now we're here going toward the end, okay? Needs assessment instruments is yet another tool, just like the DAI. But now the DAI is a static instrument, okay, as opposed to a needs assessment instrument, which is dynamic. What I mean by that, static you can't change. You can't change your date of birth. You can't change your prior history. You can't go back in time and say, well, this didn't happen. It happened, and that's what we measure. The present offense you're charged with, you can't change that. You did it. That's what you just are accused of doing. You measure that, okay? A needs assessment instrument is dynamic. These are things you begin to measure, those things you can change. Your education, for example, okay? You can change that. Even around family, you can change that. Not that you get rid of dad or mom, but even work in changing the dynamics in the family, like through multisystemic therapy and functional family therapy. And so we want to do needs assessment instrument, which is why in the criminal justice reform in House Bill 242, if we're thinking about committing a kid, we have to do a predisposition report. We have to do an assessment. And that if a judge overrides it, the judge has to justify that in the judge's order as to why they did an override. I want to point out, too, that in this whole process, we need to understand the studies show, every single study says that punishment alone increases recidivism. All right? It's treatment that will reduce recidivism. And the type of treatment is important as well, okay? For example, then we want to match the levels of treatment to the risk level of the youth. And what these studies here show, these graphs show, is that if you take a kid who is low risk and treat them as if they're high risk and give them intensive treatment, we will increase their risk of recidivate. What I said earlier, we will turn them into criminals, quite frankly. All right? But kids who need intensive treatment because they're high risk, we need to make sure. And this goes down to a systemic issue. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're bringing a bunch of kids who are low level into your system, okay, you're widening the net, increasing the risk that you're going to increase the probation caseloads. And that means most of the kids on your probation caseloads will be low-risk kids who don't need intensive supervision. What do you think that's going to be doing to the high-risk kids who need the intensive supervision? You'll be diluting their supervision. So not only are you increasing the risk of making the low-risk kids delinquent to compromise community safety, you're not able to deliver the intensive services to the high-risk kids who recidivist rates will increase because they're not getting the intensive supervision. So you get a double whammy is what you get. I'm not going to go through these, but I want to have them as part of the presentation that you can access about what are the characteristics of an effective program, what are the characteristics of an ineffective program. And then I even break it down the types of effective programs. I know that the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council and the Juvenile Justice Funding Committee that is co-chaired by Joe Hood and Joe Vignati, and that committee have put together a very, very good framework. And in fact, they tell folks out there, and, you know, and this is a very simple tool, that if you go to www.crimesolutions.gov, you have easy access to what programs work. They'll have green dots, yellow dots, promising practices, red dots, don't work. Look at the red dots, stay away from them. The yellow ones are the ones that are in the process of being researched and studied, but the green dots are the ones that we know are evidence-based. And you will find what you see here on the green dot list on crimesolutions.gov. And also what doesn't work, all right? We now know that. So we want to make sure that we spend our tax-paying money in the right way. Our taxpayers deserve a good investment on their return. Chapter 7, as I said, we're at the end here, probation, detention, decision point. I want to make, don't give up on the kids that we have adjudicated. We also can get into racial and ethnic disparities, because if we don't have objective assessments, even in probation, it can hurt. So for example, in Clayton County, we do not issue warrants for VOPs. We don't. The only time a warrant is issued on a kid on a violation of probation is if they've been absent, they've absconded for more than 24 hours. If we get a report that the kid has run away, we tell the parent to call the police on a missing person, okay? But after 24 hours is the only time that we will issue a warrant on a technical violation of probation, okay? Instead, we use graduated responses. So we have a graduated sanction grid that's broken down low level, high level, and we match it up to sanctions, okay, or responses. We even have reinforcers, because behavior is best modified using positive reinforcers over negative reinforcers. So our probation officers are trained to use positive reinforcers or rewards, okay? Just to give you an idea, this is our graduated sanctions program and its impact on the VOP warrants. Basically, that line you see down there that's near 0 represents essentially kids who absconded more than 24 hours. And we had to get them into the system to make sure that, well, by the way, one thing I didn't mention is that even on the warrants that the judges do issue, we can check a box. There's a box on there that says that intake can still release back to the parent, okay? So the kid doesn't have to go into detention even though the kid absconded, all right? What about the kid who absconded for more than 24 hours over the weekend and shows up at school on Monday morning? That happens a lot. Why would we put that kid in detention? He showed up at school. It's a good thing, okay? All right, so we want to make sure we target the high-risk offenders. So I'm going to come back to that to the end here, circle around. By increasing that supervision, we decrease recidivism. Remember that caseload discussion I had a moment ago? We only want kids on probation who are high risk. So for example, when I took the bench in 1999, we had anywhere between 95 to 150 kids on a caseload. Today, the average caseload size is about 14 to 18. That's all. That's all. But those are the kids who will break into your home, will steal your car, will point a gun, pull a knife on you if they don't get the intensive supervision. All right, but they're less likely, far less likely to do it today, because they are watched very carefully and receive appropriate treatment matched to their risk level and their needs, okay? And then so finally, the front end prevention point and the deep end detention point. How do you take the two, the front end and the back end? You know, prevention to avoid detention and deep end commitment, okay? So remember I mentioned the system of care. This is essentially the logic model. I just want you to have it so you can see that we've taken that pipeline and we have really loaded up the front end to keep kids from even getting into the pipe. That's the pathway to the deep end. But notice at the very end where you see prison, we still have a program called the Second Chance Program. These are kids where the recommendation was made by the state that the child be placed in a secure facility. In other words, they were a designated felony, charged with a designated felony. And literally, not just because they were charged with it, okay, but they are in, I mean, they're in the court, they've been detained, and literally the recommendation is that they need to go to the YDC. Well, we've developed this deep end program, and I'm not going to go into detail there, other than to point out these. I do have a slide that you can look at later that breaks down the second chance program on the deep end kids. But I want to tell you that, and I will tell you that we've had 2 or 3 kids that started off in adult court, transferred to juvenile court, and were placed in the program, armed robberies with a firearm. I know that scares a lot of people. I understand that. I don't blame you. But when you do it right, and I want you to know our partnership with the Department of Juvenile Justice, and we're an independent court, and it's a very simple deal. They're the ones who have to spend the money on the RYDC. They manage it, but isn't it interesting and ironic that I hold the key to their facility? So it's a very simple quid pro quo, and I'll put it in lawyer language in terms of a contract. I go to DJJ, or they come to me. We both sit down and we say, look, I know you don't want to spend the $200 some a day on a kid if you don't have to, but you're an independent court, and I know I can't control you, all right? But what if I give you money that's less than the $200 some a day to put it on GPS, all right? And you not put in as many kids, and you save us money at $200 some a day, okay? And you get the GPS, and so that's what we've been doing for a number of years with the Department of Juvenile Justice, and they've been involved in the second chance program, helping us because because these kids have to be on a GPS and home confinement for the first 6 months because they were supposed to be literally in a youth prison. So we have to disconnect them from the antisocial peers so that we can then get them into the right treatment programs, and they will be responsive to that and not be influenced and detracted by their antisocial peers. And so consequently, 60 participants so far have gone through the program. 26% have been revoked. Now, I say revoked because most of them literally were revoked on a technical, because we can't wait for them. We can't afford for these kind of kids to commit a new crime, because it would probably be a very bad crime. So they're revoked, but only 26 have been revoked, okay, of which only 8% were on new offenses, okay? The remainder were technical. This is compared to the 65% recidivist rates of those who are committed. In other words, had they gone on to a YDC, within 3 years, 65% of them would have recidivated anyway, all right? But we're revoking at a 26% after this is over now going on 5 years. By the way, it's now, this alone, these 60 participants have saved the state about $4.3 million, okay? Lastly, the quad CST is part of the system of care. That is our single point of entry. So that's prevention, and even probationers can be referred to the quad CST, the Clayton County Collaborative Child Study Team, multidisciplinary folks who move around into the schools. Their job is to handle the chronically disruptive kids, assess them, and get them on a pathway to graduate. And so with that said, what that means is that we want to ensure that the kids, that we identify them early on in the schools and address their needs. So we do CAFA scoring on the kids, which to date shows an 83% improvement in their behavior, which has led to at least 23% increase in their reading and math scores. Okay, and that consequently has led to my last 2 slides, that best practices in a collaborative system improve safety. It will reduce disproportionate minority contact. This is your juvenile crime rate, where you see complaints, you see how it's fallen, okay, declined significantly. But here's my last slide. Keeping kids in school out of court improves community safety. Our graduation rates, and this is an interesting thing, our graduation rates actually have increased by 25%. Now, you may read in the paper, keep in mind, and this is kind of a footnote, because people get thrown off by this, the United States Department of Education required that we change the way we report graduation rates in 2011. Before 2011, you reported overall graduation rates. Our overall graduation rates in 2003 was 58%, okay, 58%, all-time low. By the time of 2011, it had increased to about 85%, okay? But then they flipped it to on-time graduation rates. When you start in the 9th grade, do you graduate within 4 years? Well, everyone's graduation rates dropped at that point, okay? Clayton County's, get this, went down to 51%. Could you imagine in 2003 when we had a 58% overall graduation rate, what the on-time graduation rates were like? Probably in the 30s, okay? All right, but that explains why. So we look at 51 like, well, my gracious, 51 compared to what it probably was like in 2003. However, get this, the state released the 2013 graduation rates 2 weeks ago. Clayton County high schools posted the highest increase in the state of Georgia. Since 2011, we've posted a 9% increase in on-time graduation rates. Imagine what the overall graduation rates are like now. They're probably now about 89, 90%, okay? How goes graduation? So goes crime. We need to focus on kids, focus on schools, best practices, objective assessment instruments at the front end, at the disposition hearing, using graduated response grids, positive rewards, and not give up on the deep end. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I will conclude my presentation on evidence-based practices and how it can reduce DMC and bringing in objectivity in our assessment process, as well as alternative programs and what they look like. So I'm going to turn the helm over to my good friend, the Deputy Commissioner Carl Brown from the Department of Juvenile Justice, who is going to speak to us now about the philosophy behind the DAI and how it has positively impacted the reduction in DMC. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Judge Teskey. One of the things about following Judge Teskey is you start making notes of things that you wanted to mention that he has included in his presentation, but I think it's important that we all talk about those things that are relevant to the subject matter today. On behalf of Commissioner Avery Niles, who could not be here with us today, I certainly want to extend thanks to Executive Director Bunn and the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council for inviting us to be a part of this very important topic. How I would like to start is just basically talking about my experiences with the detention assessment instrument and how it has evolved over a period of time. I started with the agency back in 1987 as what we called back then a court service worker, and was sworn in as an intake officer with the court. So as an intake officer, we are responsible for making intake decisions as to which kids should or should not be detained. Now, back during that time frame, I had no type of instrument to make those decisions. So as kids were taken into custody by law enforcement, I essentially had to use my gut instinct to make a decision as to whether that child should be detained or released back into their parents' custody. That was happening throughout the state of Georgia back then. And as a result, we had facilities that were capable of holding 30 youth, holding up to 90 plus kids in detention. Conditions worsened, and over a period of time, it drew the attention of the Department of Justice. And as a result, in the late 90s, the Department of Justice came into the state of Georgia, and not only was overcrowding one of the issues in Georgia at the time, but there were other programmatic challenges that we faced as an agency. As a result of that, we entered into a memorandum of agreement with the Department of Justice to fix some of the challenges that we faced as a state and as an agency. And one of the conditions of that agreement was that we develop what we call now a detention assessment instrument. And a detention assessment instrument is a screening instrument that does two things. It identifies the likelihood of a youth committing a future offense while awaiting court, and 2, the likelihood of the youth failing to appear in court. So that is what the instrument is designed to do. It was important that we implement such an instrument because what we were seeing prior to its use is that a kid in Waycross may be looked at totally different than a kid in Atlanta that commits the same type of offense. So the instrument was designed to create consistency and standardization about how we look at those kids. One of the things that I wanted to read to you all in regards to that instrument, we were in partnership with the National Council on Crime and Delinquency, often referred to as NCCD, and they did an executive summary on the work with the DAI. The DAI that we were using, Detention Assessment Instrument, was implemented in the year 2000. There had not been significant changes to that instrument since that period of time, and we, of course, are in 2014 now. So we were using a very outdated instrument. And based on their analysis of the existing DAI or the old DAI, and regardless of the DAI's detention recommendation, the majority of the youth across all risk levels, and the instrument scores based on low risk, high risk, medium risk. 68% of the low risk youth and 79% of the medium risk youth were being detained. So we knew based on that data that the instrument that's been in use since 2000 was not serving us well. Through the work of the special counsel and recent legislation, we were required to update that detention assessment instrument. And some of this information was critical to the development of a new instrument based on the alarming information that we discovered based on this. One of the things that I think is important when we're talking about the detention assessment instrument that has to be part of the conversation when we're talking about DMC. As an intake worker, you are responsible for making an intake decision on a youth that is taken into custody by law enforcement. Consequently, you have no control over who's taken into custody. You're just making a decision as to whether they should be detained. So when we're having a conversation about DMC, I think it's important that that conversation expand to law enforcement as well. And I think over the years, they have become much more in tune with the need for how we look at kids in regards to detention. But think that's an important piece of the conversation that we should not miss. As I mentioned, the old DAI, which was implemented in 2000, when we implemented that instrument, one of the challenges that we faced is that we implemented it with very little stakeholder involvement. And of course, one of the critical partners of the agency, of course, is the judges. We had very little involvement from the judiciary, as well as prosecutors and public defenders who were key stakeholders in the process. As a result, we did not have consistent use of that detention assessment instrument because of that. So as we began the process of looking at the new detention assessment instrument and based on lessons learned, we wanted to approach this process a whole lot differently than we did initially. And as a result, we reached out not only to judges and public defenders and prosecutors, but we also reached out to law enforcement, the school system, child advocates, family and children's services, and many others that we believed were key stakeholders in the process. And we wanted their input to make sure that we were creating an instrument that would be widely supported. And through criminal justice reform, it was mandated by law that the new detention assessment instrument be used by all courts. So that was one advantage as well that we believe will have an impact on disproportionate minority contact. When a youth is taken into custody, the intake worker is required to complete the DAI, and it determines whether or not the child will be released with conditions, or whether that child will be detained. And Judge Teske spoke a little bit about some of this earlier. If a child is released with conditions, that child could be placed on what we call housebound detention, could be provided with wraparound services, electronic monitor, and several things of that nature to sustain that child within their own community. And I failed to mention that we have 26 facilities around the state to house young offenders within our system if it's determined that they are a public safety risk and need to be detained. It was important that we implement a new DAI as part of reform so that we manage the front end gate, as Judge Teske spoke about earlier. We are the gatekeepers to detention and want to make sure that we're not detaining kids, as Judge Teske referenced in his presentation, because they make us mad, but we're detaining kids because they are a true public safety risk. So it's important, once again, that we have everyone involved in that process, particularly law enforcement. I want to talk a little bit about the factors that we look at within the detention assessment instrument, because I think that's important as well. And through our work, we were able to determine the most predictive factors in regards to kids that may be at higher risk. So through the detention assessment instrument, we look at the most serious current offenses. And we also take into consideration their past history as well. We look at additional charges that are pending adjudication. We look at prior failure to appear and prior escapes, prior adjudicated charges and prior adjudicated probation violations and administrative revocations. And we look at the youth's current legal status and the youth's prior court involvement as well. Those are weighed and assigned a point schedule based on that information, and then a detention recommendation is made. The youth detention assessment score is classified into one of three categories. Secure detention for youth scoring 12 or higher, release with conditions for a youth scoring 8 to 11 points, and unconditional release to a parent or guardian for a youth scoring fewer than 7 points. Now, one of the things that I think is important in the conversation is that these instruments are developed in a manner that we do have aggravating and mitigating circumstances that can drive that detention decision of whether or not that child is detained. And also judicial overrides can be implemented into the scoring system as well. So we have passed this new detention assessment instrument back in July of this year. The DJJ board approved the new instrument for implementation. It is a bit early to tell what type of impact we are having in regards to that, but I can say that one of the things that Judge Teske mentioned based on the information provided by Pew is that over 60% of the kids that were being detained were youth of color, which was very disturbing based on the population makeup within the state of Georgia. So we have been working hard to address those challenges, not only through this instrument, but as Judge Teske referenced in his presentation, we have also spent, with the leadership of our governor, we were able to implement through juvenile justice reform incentive grants for the courts to be able to provide community-based services for those courts to reduce the number of children that were detained on the front end. And early indications are revealing to us that a lot of those youth are now being served within our local communities with evidence-based programs rather than being incarcerated within our system. That's important because one of the things that we had noticed as an agency, particularly as we looked at the back end of our system when we speak about recidivism, is that we were locking up, as I mentioned earlier, low and medium risk kids. And what happens is that they are educated while they're in that environment and sometimes come out more challenging to us than they went into the system. So we have worked hard to make sure that we have addressed that piece. And I think it's important in this conversation as well that we talk about what a population of kids that is often referred to now as CHINs, which is children in need of services. These are our kids that are truant from school, unruly with their parents, violate curfew, run away from home, things of that nature. Under reform, it changed the scope where those kids should not be detained in secure facilities. So that population alone will now be served in the community, and the courts have went about establishing community risk reduction programs to address those kids. And from a statistical standpoint, we also believe that that will certainly be an impact in regards to DMC, that we're able to get in the homes and provide services not only to that child, but their family, to stabilize that child within their own community, to, of course, ultimately prevent them from committing a delinquent offense that could potentially place them in secure confinement. So we have done a lot of work in regards to disproportionate minority contact as an agency. That is a conversation that we often have. And fortunately, some of the things that we're doing through juvenile justice reform, we feel will directly impact the work that we're doing as an agency. So I don't have as much as Judge Teske, but I hope this information has been helpful to you all this morning and this early afternoon. And I thank you for your time. We also have with us here Diana Aspinwall, who is Assistant Deputy Commissioner with the Department of Juvenile Justice, and fortunate enough to have her within my division as a support. And we wanted her to be here to talk about the continued work of the agency as well in regards to school-based supervision. We've had this program in place for a few years now, and she will speak specifics in regards to that. But we have been working to approach our ability to impact kids entering the front gates of detention, not only through the detention assessment instrument, but also by working closely with the school systems. Because one of the things that we discovered is that while school is in session, we get our most business from referrals from the school system. So we felt like it was important that we work hand in hand with the local school systems to try to impact that front gate entry of those kids within the system. So please welcome to the stage now Diana Aspinwall, Assistant Deputy Commissioner with the Department of Juvenile Justice.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner Brown. It is a pleasure to be here with you all today. A little bit about what we do in the community with the Department of Juvenile Justice and the team in the community. The staff that work with us in the Department of Juvenile Justice, specifically in the community, is responsible for supervision of youth that are under community supervision. We carry out supervision in the community for those youth, and I think it's important to give a little historical perspective to this conversation before we get too deeply into the conversation. Prior to to assuming this role, many years ago, I worked as a case expediter here in DeKalb County. And there were, on numerous occasions, I would see kids come into intake brought in by school resource officers. And one might think that when school is out, that our detention populations would go up. Actually, that is not the case. When school is in session, our detention populations actually go up. And school resource officers are actually a major referral source for us. And so one of the things that we have done within the Department of Juvenile Justice is we have established school-based probation officers. And this actually is not something that is unique to Georgia. It was actually first started in Pennsylvania back in 2003, and it's a model program with OJJDP. And we first piloted this program several years ago, and it first started in one of our districts, District 9 in Dublin, Georgia. And it had tremendous outcomes for us with our kids. And what we found is that with having our probation officers in the school, we were able to keep our kids engaged in the school setting, and we were able to immediately address any issues specific to our kids. We're not there to be the disciplinarian per se for any kid that's having issues in the school. We are there specifically for the youth that we serve. The program has been a big asset for us, and it has had tremendous outcomes for our youth. Just in the last year, some of the outcomes specifically that we've seen is we've had a 26% decrease in the dropout rate for our kids, and a 30% decrease in our truancy rate. We've had a 10% decrease in our late arrivals to school, and a 25% decrease in our suspension and expulsion rate. We served last year in 96 schools statewide, and we had 64 school-based officers. Now, in those schools, we could not have a full-time officer, so sometimes because of the numbers that we had in a specific school, we would have the officer divide their time during the day, so they may spend the first part of their day at one school and then transition to another school during the second part of the day. We were able, and this is, I think, enormous for us, we were able to divert 669 kids from having a formal complaint filed against them simply because we had an officer in school, and we were able to immediately address what the concern was. And I think that that's a very big plus for having the school-based officer there. One of the other skill sets that the school-based probation officer brings with them is the restorative group conferencing. And this is a skill set that, for those of you that may not know a whole lot about restorative group conferencing, is that both the person that has had the harm done to them, as well as the person that has done the harm, both have to mutually agree to be present and talk about the harm that was done, and they resolve the issue without taking it to court or in front of a formal process, so it keeps the kid out of court. And we've had a lot of success in our school settings with those kind of situations, so where there may be a fight or a conflict with a teacher. We've had a lot of success in school with restorative group conferencing. This year, so far, we are in 111 schools. So we've already increased this year our number of schools that we are in. And we're looking to expand those partnerships. Each time that we enter a new school, we enter what we call an MOU. So we hit the ground with a mutual understanding between the school about what our roles will be. But some of the positives of having a school-based probation officer would be the positive mentoring aspect that comes along with having a school-based probation officer in the school setting. A little bit about the collaboration aspect is that it has increased the positive way that we're seen in the school community there. So it's not seen so much as a negative of having DJJ in your school system. It's seen very much as a positive. And for our kids, I think it's very important for our kids, at least, to keep them engaged, that we know that keeping our kids engaged in school is a key to their success. And we definitely have seen the benefit of, at least in our data and our outcomes and our kids, of being there and being able to keep our kids engaged in the school setting. And, you know, especially for our kids to be able to feel what success feels like at that moment and transition to the next grade is very important for them. Also, for our kids that are transitioning out of longer-term facilities, we've seen the benefit of having a school-based probation officer there for them as well, because it helps in that transition and that reentry back from a placement or a long-term facility. It helps in their reintegration process. So we are looking to partner for additional schools. The only criteria that we need is that we need to have a population at that particular school for DJJ kids, and a large enough population. We'd like to have at least 10 kids in a particular school in order to devote a school-based probation officer for a particular site. So that is school-based probation for the Department of Juvenile Justice, and I thank you for your time.